This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Today, Tim Daly, CEO of EdNavigator, joins us to discuss whether America should refocus our efforts on our lowest performing students. Then, on the Research Minute, Amber shares a study about how students prepare for tests and whether those strategies are effective. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show. Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now, please join me in welcoming our special guest for this week, Tim Daly. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Yeah, Tim is the CEO and founder of EdNavigator, which helps parents find great educational options for their kids, among many other things. Also joining us, as always, a man whose navigational skills are legendary, David Griffith.
Hey, Mike. Always a pleasure.
It's great to have you.
Not sure what that means.
David. I'm just, I got to play around with it, got to have fun with it. Well, gentlemen, it is great to see you. We are recording this early in the week that is the week of NAEP release for 2020. Well, the NAEP 2024 released here in January of 2025. I have not seen the results yet. I assume you guys have not either. There are rumors swirling. I think at this point, the press probably has seen them. I think everything we're seeing from other tests, the international assessments that we're seeing lately, the state test, though, and some of the rumors out there is that it's going to be more bad news, that we're hearing the bottom continues to fall out, that we're seeing particularly just lack of progress, even declines at the low end of achievement. Let's assume that is the case. Tim, I asked you to come on to talk about what the heck we should do about that. So let's do that on Ed Reform Update. All right, so Tim, listeners here know I'm obsessed with this question about why is it that we saw scores start to go down even before the pandemic. That in the 2010s, you start to see the slow and then eventually pretty steady decline, especially at the 10th and the 25th percentiles on NAEP, on international assessments and some others. We've got theories, right? For a while there, I was saying, well, the Great Recession, impact on family poverty, school funding. Carabo Jackson had a paper on the school funding impact. Maybe the phones and the screens, and you've written about that, right? I mean, this is around the same time that suddenly everybody had a smartphone in their pocket, or we saw, by the way, even scores for kindergartners start to go down according to the map that NWEA puts out, the map assessment. So maybe little kids were too much on screens, right? And then some people have said, look, it could certainly be our fault, those of us in education policy, back in the No Child Left Behind days when low achievers were really doing great, making huge progress. The focus was narrowly on the low achieving kids. It said under No Child Left Behind, we really meant it. Do not leave anybody behind. Get everybody over a very low bar. That was kind of minimum competency. We called it proficiency, but it was minimum competency to get everybody there. And there was a lot of evidence that schools were focusing very much on those kids and they did better. And then we moved away from that. Right? We said we got to set a higher bar with the Common Core. We got to move to a growth measure instead of focusing just on, we wanted to focus on more kids at a higher level. Maybe we left low performers behind. So first of all, tell me, of all of those explanations, are there any that seem more likely to you than others? Or maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe at this point it doesn't matter. Oh, and of course, last one, right? Then the COVID pandemic and everything went over a cliff. Okay. Yeah. With the school closures. So maybe it doesn't matter because I really want to get to what the heck do we do now. But I would be curious what you make of all of that.
I think it does matter. It's really hard to know these things because we get information from things like NAEP, but we can't, tell on a 50-state basis why scores are going up or not going up. But I think it does matter because it was going to inform what our strategies are to fix it. And I think that our sector has a very odd aversion to historical reckoning and digging into things. I think you you've been a consistent voice out there asking these questions and talking about them, writing about them. And I think you started writing about this before the pandemic, right? Some of the early things. So you were aware of it then, but it doesn't come up that much. And people are very quick to sort of say, well, what you're talking about now, that's in the past. The kids that first started to show those signs, they're not even in the school in K-12 anymore. Let's worry about the kids that we have in front of us. But I think that there is a lot of evasion about this. And it's one thing if the only issue we were dealing with is that our upward progress slowed, but we're talking about a situation where it completely halted and then started to decline. So I do think it matters. I think it's very hard to know, and especially because we've seen these changes on a 50-state basis, it's probably many things, and we should probably be a little bit more inclined to believe the things that happened everywhere. So, for example, when people point to very narrow things like, for example, Common Core, not every state embraced Common Core. Some of them went full force. Some of them kind of did it in name only. If we saw that was a big predictor of this, then maybe that would hold some credence, but I sort of doubt it. I do think that you just touched on something, though, that I think was really important, which is that our definition of improving schools was helping kids pass very low bar tests. Mm-hmm. And we did that pretty consistently, for 10 or 15 years. That was the coin of the realm. And there were two parts to that. One, you had to be improving. And if you weren't, there was real pressure from above. You might lose control of your school system. Superintendents would lose their jobs. And the second part of that was you had to be moving up against a bar that essentially was not being a very, very low performer. And I think that since the bar got raised, which we all thought was going to be wonderful, aim for something more ambitious, a lot of the students that are very low performers aren't even close to that bar. And I think it's reasonable to ask whether they're getting a lot less focus. But long story short, I think there's probably influence from many of these things. And we ought to be putting a lot more elbow grease into parsing it out so we know what we should do next.
Yeah, and look, and I should have introduced you better than I did, Tim. I mean, Tim, has a background as a teacher, and then you were the head of TNTP for many years, and in the heyday of the ed reform days, when we were holding schools and districts accountable to getting kids over that low bar. So there's that accountability piece. There's also the instructional piece, right? Yeah. I mean, the concern back then was that because the tests were so much pitched at this low level, we are encouraging this very narrow and kind of low level of instruction, drill and kill, and, and math, basic math facts instead of conceptual understanding. But maybe maybe that was helpful for the lowest performing kids. And then the shift to the Common Core, higher standards, I do wonder. There's talk about, well, what should you do? What should teachers do for those kids who are on the low end of achievement? And we use these words that sometimes to me feel like magic words, scaffolding. We should scaffold instruction. We should accelerate. Whatever we do, we should not remediate, right? And I've used these words, and I sometimes now think, God, what the heck do they mean? And was that bad advice? Like, hey, maybe we do need to remediate kids. Like maybe that was, so tell us. I mean, I know, you're a little more removed from the classroom these days, but on the instructional side, do you think it's possible that we changed the way, the advice we gave to teachers on that?
I mean, I think there's definitely something to that. Here's what I'd say. The thing that really good teachers do consistently is that they earn student effort, meaning that as the rigor of the material goes up, they get student effort to rise with it. And weaker teachers don't think they can do that, so they make it easy for the kids and nobody wins. Or they make it hard, but they don't know how to get the effort to rise along with it. And so students struggle or disengage. That's it. And teachers who are working with better materials and able to do those things are the best of all worlds. Mm-hmm. But part of what is necessary in that entire paradigm is that there has to be demanding environment. Students don't learn when they don't think. And if the classroom is not a place where rich things are going on, they're not gonna do the thinking that leads to learning. There's a million ways to get there. There's teaching styles vary widely. Progressive pedagogy works for some teachers. Very traditional pedagogy works for other teachers. There's a lot of ways to do it. But I think the bigger question that we should be asking is, do we believe that there are differences in the level of demand that we're placing on students in terms of asking them to reach further and higher than was the case then? There's some reasons to believe yes. Kids tell us that they're less engaged in school. They tell us that they do less homework. Teachers talk constantly about battling for student attention, and I don't think that it's just on the instructional side. Outside of school, we as parents allow kids to spend way more time on screens. Our kids read less. We read less to them. We're more distracted when we're around our kids. All of those things have been part of changes in adult life for the past decade. And I think that I'm a little bit concerned that as parents, we no longer want school to push our kids in those ways. That sometimes when kids come home and they have work to do, that we're too quick to say, no, we don't want them to be stressed about this. We don't want drill and kill, as you said, or we want them to have time for extracurriculars. All of those things, I think, could be at play here. And the only way out of this is to figure out how to get students engaged in instruction that's going to help them. And when the results are going down, it's really hard not to be suspicious that they're not engaged.
All right, so let's hammer in on that then. The big focus in recent years has been high dosage tutoring as the way to fill in gaps or to get kids re-engaged. Mixed results now as we see that play out. I mean, is that we need to double down on that? We need to, I don't know, go back to more grade retention, stop moving kids along. We need to, what is it? What are we going to do now to change what's happening in our schools so that this trend stops and starts going in the right direction again, especially for the kids at the 10th and the 25th percentile?
One thing is we need more leadership to clarify what we want from schools. I think a lot of people in schools feel like we've asked them to take on many more things, things that they're not always good at. So if you ask schools what they've been doing with hiring in recent years, they've been hiring a ton of people that aren't teachers, right? They've been hiring guidance counselors. They've been trying to do more mental health support. They've been trying to be more well-rounded. Those things may be important, but in many cases, I think asking them to focus on more things probably makes it harder for them to do those things well. I think that your point, when I think about clarity of leadership, some of it is we need to very quickly cut the number of very low performers in half. This is not, we don't need to make a small change to it. It needs to be cut in half. There are huge numbers of kids whose skills are so low that they are going to struggle in life. But we shouldn't forget the other end of the continuum, which is we have very few high performers. And the high performers that we have today compared to pre-COVID are much less diverse. And what I mean is the kids who have stayed high performers are wealthier. They're much more likely to be white and Asian students. And in most states, the number of kids of color who are in that high performing level has really decreased. So if I were going to ask for two things from school districts in the short term, it would be cut the bottom in half and double the top, because I think that's going to push them in directions that are probably going to be good for everyone. And I don't want to forget the middle. I concede that most kids are there. But I think that the biggest issues that we have actually are on both extremes. We just don't talk as much about the top performers because for pretty affluent kids with well-educated parents, I actually think they're okay on that top end. But we've missed the fact that the top end no longer includes kids who we really want to be there.
Well, you're singing our tune here at Fordham. David, what do you think? Especially in this question of, okay, let's say we want to cut the number of kids at the low end in half, which we did, by the way, in the 90s and 2000s. Huge progress at cutting the percentage of kids below basic, especially Black and Hispanic students. We made that kind of progress. How do we do it again?
Yeah, I know you're going to roll your eyes a little bit, Mike, because I'm a broken record on this. But I simply have to say something about screens. If I asked you a multiple choice question like the following, is the decline in achievement at the bottom end of the spectrum due to A, the spectacular economic growth that the United States has experienced over the last 2 decades, which has been concentrated among low earners, B, a bunch of technocratic changes that federal policymakers made in the early 2000s, or C, a universal, highly addictive new technology that is in every kid's hands 24 hours a day and is essentially consciousness altering. Which of those explanations makes the most sense to you? We have to talk about this. We have to. And we're starting to wrap our hands around it. And I realize that some reformers will react by saying, well, you're letting the schools off the hook again. But actually, no, I'm not. That's like saying that doctors shouldn't talk about smoking, right? we need our teachers to be at the forefront of a national movement that gets phones out of kids' hands, that generates a broad acceptance that social media is terrible for anyone under the age of like 25, that recognizes that, short YouTube videos are not the way to get the news, right? We have to get it back somehow. And the only way to do that is to talk about it. And I think it's going to be extremely difficult. I agree with every word that Tim said. And I do think that there has been a loss of focus on kids at the bottom. But we are swimming against incredibly powerful currents for the last decade and a half. And we're way behind the eight ball. And we're not going to get it back until we focus on the problem that actually exists as I see it. And that is that kids are not paying attention.
Yeah, no, look, I find it compelling, David. I mean, there is the question of, why does it have this worse impact on the low achievers? I mean, and why don't we see it in some other countries where we know kids are addicted to phones as well? But Tim, I mean, you work with parents, families all the time. I mean, can you imagine some kind of big campaign having some success at getting parents to take the phones away or to limit screen time more than?
Yeah, I think a campaign that's built around focus and giving kids space and the ability to concentrate, I think would they be receptive to it? I'll tell you, as we think about the results that are coming on Wednesday, one of the things that I'm curious about is what we see with Catholic schools, because I think Catholic schools have been quicker to clamp down on phones and less apologetic about it. And if it turns out that the academic situation there is more promising, I would take note of that. I think they also have been a little bit more skeptical of some of the very like tech dependent, tech heavy trends. So we'll see. Maybe we'll learn something from that. I think that the question of focus and engagement, screens are a part of it. But I actually think there are other parts of it that kind of connect here that we shouldn't lose. So, for instance, student absenteeism, right? There's the kids who, when they're in school, aren't focused. Then there's the kids who just aren't coming to school, right? And why are they not coming to school? Their world is very connected when they're not there. It's not boring to stay home the way that it once was, where you're kind of like watching soap operas or game shows, right? There are kids who have a lot of other things, and some kids who even feel like they're participating in school meaningfully because they're handing things in. But there's another dimension of disengagement that we almost never talk about, which is teacher absenteeism. We have a lot of teachers that are missing a lot more school, right? And one of the reasons we don't talk about it is because the data are not nearly as widespread as student absenteeism. So many states chose student absenteeism as a goal for their federal reporting, so we can see that. But the few states where they do report teacher absenteeism, Illinois is one, I think Rhode Island is another, it's terrible. And if a student misses school, we're pretty sure that the kids learn less, right? When a teacher misses school, we absolutely know that their kids learn less. There's nobody disputes that in the slightest. And so if we have places like Chicago, where 40% of the teachers don't meet the state's attendance target, which is to miss fewer than 10 days per year, 40%, that's a lot of classrooms. So I think, David, you're right about the level of addictiveness of screens and social media. But I think that we should connect it to some of these other things, which is how much of our total potential energy do we have focused on classrooms? And is it just the kids who are distracted and not as present, or do we also have issue with adults?
Yeah, no. And this crisis of authority, right? I mean, we are in this moment where nobody seems to trust authority figures at all. And I don't know if educational leaders are afraid to tell their teachers, get to school, no questions asked. I mean, unless you're like super, super sick. And likewise with kids, enough with it, and hold people accountable. That tough love, that sense of energy, and there was a sense of urgency in the 2000s. Certainly, you felt it in charter schools and big charter networks. The clock was ticking, and if we were going to give kids an opportunity, have any chance to be successful in our economy and in this country, we had to make use of every minute as best we could, and we got to work hard and all row together. I don't know. It feels like we're just afraid to ask people to do that anymore.
Let me ask this question, Mike, if you'll allow me. So do you think that in whatever the results are on Wednesday, some states are probably not going to do as well as they hoped? Maybe lots of states won't. Mm-hmm. Districts will get results as well. Mm-hmm. I think there's 25 districts or so in the urban trial. So we're going to know how Los Angeles did. We're going to know how Denver and New York did. How likely do you think it is that a school board at the state or district level convenes when these results come out, says these results are unacceptable and we have to make a leadership change?
Yep. Extremely.
I would be
small.
shocked. I would be absolutely flabbergasted if a state board convened a meeting to do that, or a district board. And I think the likelihood that would have happened, I don't know, pick a date 20 years ago, would be pretty high. If the results were bad, I think that you would have had that. So to your point about the crisis in kind of saying that this isn't good enough, education is definitely a results-driven business in the long term. Like for kids, we know that the results that they get determine a lot about their long-term opportunities. It is not at the retail level or at the policy level right now a results-driven business. It hasn't been, and we'll see if that changes. But I think that's one of the most striking things about the moment that we're in.
All right. We are going to have to leave it there on that very pessimistic note, but I think honest and realistic as well. Great discussion, guys. Really appreciate it. Tim Daly, CEO of EdNavigator, also the author of it's called the Education Daily on Substack. It is fantastic. You should check that out. Tim, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
All right. Now it's time for everyone's favorite Amber's Research Minute. Amber, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mike.
Well, I must send my condolences to your Washington Commanders.
What an awful game. Oh my gosh, so depressing. We just got stomped.
Yeah, but what a Cinderella story of a season.
It was, but man, you get that close, you just, you really start tasting it, Mike, and then it doesn't happen, and it's quite a blow.
I hear you. Hey, I mean, Jaden Daniels, surely Rookie of the Year.
Yes.
A lot of promise for years to come.
Absolutely. He's calm, cool, and collected. He's a nice guy, and we're hanging on to him for at least 5 years.
Yeah. So there you go.
So.
All right. So that's what's happening in football. What is happening in education research?
Always have a new study out. This time we are going to the UK. We have a topic that I actually never given a study about, which is how students study. So it's actually basically looking at how students study on their own when they're preparing for a test, assuming that, kids are still studying for tests. We hope they are. So historically, we've had very little research on what strategies are most effective for learning. But there have been a bunch of new studies that have been growing recently, and a few have apparently begun to sort of bin different strategies and buckets that have higher utility, meaning they're more related to improved outcomes on exams, as well as ones that have lower or moderate utility. And so this study pulls from all these other studies that says, okay, here is, what we think we know, at least today, about these strategies. And they have a random, stratified random sample of kids in North Wales, okay, who are studying for a science test, which these study strategies they're apparently could use these. And they're also asking which strategies that teachers are encouraging kids to use. The kids are scheduled to take the GCSE, which maybe some of us know. That's the General Certificate of Secondary Education, which kids, I guess, in Europe take in their 9th and 10th grade year. And then they have to, I guess, perform pretty decently on that test before they can move to their A levels, which, again, as I understand it, you take during your last 2 years of college, 2 years of high school in order to qualify for college. Okay, so that's sort of some of the context. The study has a representative sample of almost 400 secondary kids aged 14 to 15. They're from 29 secondary schools in Wales. They drew the sample in such a way that every eligible school student had an equal chance of being selected, and they allowed representation by each ability level for each school in the correct proportion. Okay, so they tried to basically have a representative sample as much as you can for these schools in Wales. They weighted the responses as needed to account for school non-response and other issues. But again, kind of a stretch on the representation front outside of secondary science school kids in Wales. All right, 9 study strategies, though. This is what I thought was interesting. The 3 that had weak research behind them and ask yourself, how often did I do this when I was a kid? Highlighting or underlining information, repeatedly reading information, and writing notes that summarize the information. Weak research base. The ones with moderate research evidence is something called interleaved practice, which means that you alternate between different topics or concepts while you study. So instead of focusing on one topic at a time for an extended period, like I'm going to study history for an hour and then I'm going to study science for an hour, you alternate between the two for 30 minutes. The idea is you're forcing your brain to actively recall information that isn't immediate. The two with the strong research evidence are doing practice test and spaced practice, which means spreading out study sessions over time leading up to a test, as opposed to, they didn't use this word, but I will, cramming. The three that they are less sure about, but they include because, a little suggestive research, are mind maps, which means you create a map like a Venn diagram of how these ideas that you're learning about are connected to other ideas that you already understand and know. Using flashcards, not quite sure how effective that is, so that was put in there. And something I call elaborate coding, which seemed to me like a mind map, but the big difference was you use mnemonics to come up with ways to remember things. So like, Roy G. Biv for the colors of the rainbow. All right. Bottom line, the learning strategies used by most kids for independent study on the science test were the ones with little research behind them. They like to write out notes, they like to reread info, and they like to highlight and underline. Further, most kids don't even really know about those more effective strategies, or if they do, they're not doing them, like the spaced practice thing where you're supposed to, not cram. In the open-ended response, they also coded those, and a lot of kids said that in addition to these 9 things they were asked about, they also watched a lot of YouTube videos and Bite Size, which I don't know what that is, but it's some kind of online web resource, I guess, that helps them to study whatever they're trying to study. And then they indicated that, yes, they would be very open to learning more about these other strategies. And then when they looked at what the teachers were encouraging them to do, the teachers encouraged them to do a mix of both effective and ineffective. So teachers were kind of all over the place. But anyway, they close with saying, maybe this would make a difference, relative to what kids are able to retain and learn, but we need to know more.
Okay. Very good. I'm glad there was a little mention of YouTube and bite-sized things. I don't know, is that TikTok or something like it? Because it sounded so old-fashioned, most of it, right? Gosh, you got a highlighter? I mean, do they sell those anymore? Is that a thing?
You mean like this?
Oh, Amber, yes. Yes. Did you buy that in the 90s?
I think I got it from the Fordham office. Thank you very much.
All right. Just teasing. No. And look, this is why things like homework is so important, because that's how you encourage some of this, not to cram, but to do the studying over time, right? Well-crafted homework assignments or practice tests over time. And so some of these efforts we've seen, at least over on this side of the pond, to, not use homework assignments and grades or all this other nonsense, is a real problem, right? You gotta probably nudge kids to do things that are good for them, like to not wait to the last minute to cram. I don't know. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it makes me wonder how much of the debate over homework is really a debate about, useless homework versus useful homework. And I think you're right. A lot of this is at least theoretically built into what good teachers do. So it seems to me like getting teachers up to speed is one of the main things that we could do, right? If we feel like there's enough of a consensus. I don't know. I've heard the highlighting thing before, that it just doesn't work. And so I don't have a highlighter. I was a little surprised. I thought the mnemonics thing, I thought there was some brain science behind that. So I was surprised there wasn't more of a little bit more of a research basis for that. But yeah, I mean, homework is a huge chunk of school, right? And so we should be trying to maximize it the way we maximize everything else. And it doesn't seem like we've made much of an effort. So I agree. This is kind of, new undiscovered territory.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And low hanging fruit, right? I mean, to me, the big
Yeah.
challenge is just to get kids motivated enough to do anything, right?
Right.
Towards the end of learning. But if they are motivated enough to study and they're doing it in a way that's not helping them, then having them study more effectively, boom, that's something worth trying.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And some would be kind of fun, right? Like I would think coming up with a mind map of like ideas that you already know and how they might be related to things you don't know. Like some of that kind of sounds like fun, like more fun than rereading something 5 times, right?
I could never stand that stuff.
I guess on a relative basis, yes. Yes. I guess I can understand what kind of student you were, Amber. That sounds like fun.
All right, maybe a little nerdy, but hey.
All right. And hey, if we are nothing, if not a little nerdy here on the Education Gadfly Show, but that's great. Thank you, Amber, for that. That is,
Yes.
Unfortunately, though, all the time we've got for this week. So until next week,
I'm David Griffith.
and I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.